All righty. Well, good evening to all of you. My name is Zach Judd, and I'm the Director of Education at Florida Oceanographic Society. It is my absolute greatest pleasure to welcome all of you tonight to the very first installment of our 2022 Coastal Lecture Series. I'm sorry that we're not gathered together in person like we have been in years past, but I'm also hopeful that this Zoom format will let us reach a bigger audience than we ever have before. So this is night one, which means I'm going to give a little bit of a longer introduction. I know that many of you have been a part of this lecture series for years and years. You don't miss a single Tuesday night lecture, but some of you are probably attending for the very first time. So this is my chance to tell you a little bit more about the lecture series and hopefully get you interested in attending all 9 of our lectures this year. Before we move along too far, I want to go over just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping, if you will. Most importantly, during our webinar tonight, your microphone is going to remain muted and your camera is going to be turned off the whole time. So there's no way that we can hear you or see you. Feel free to enjoy your evening however you please. That said, if you do have a question for our guest speaker, please type it into the Q&A box that you'll find down on the bottom of your Zoom screen. At the end of the lecture tonight, we'll do our very best to go through all of those questions. Now, depending on what device you're watching us on tonight, you should be able to adjust the size of your video screen. So there's a slider in the middle of your screen. You can slide it to the right to make the PowerPoint larger. You can slide it to the left to make our video feeds a little bit larger. So you can play around with that to come up with the best size for your viewing tonight. Again, since this is the first night of our series, I want to go over some of our upcoming lectures. We have a really stellar lineup this year, and I'm hopeful that all of you will register for all of these lectures. Right now, we have more people registered for tonight's lecture than any of the others. If you have any friends or family members who might be interested in the 8 upcoming lectures that I'm about to mention, feel free to share this with them. So on February 1st, we've got a really interesting presentation about clam restoration in the Indian River Lagoon. These aren't just any clams, these are super clams, clams that have somehow managed to survive for decades as water quality in the Indian River Lagoon has gone downhill. Theoretically, these super tough clams might be able to survive into the future, but they need a little bit of help. So this presentation by Dr. Todd Osborne from the University of Florida is really going to focus on efforts to aquaculture the strongest of strong clams and get them back out in the Indian River Lagoon. And this is a project that Florida Oceanographic Society is actually a partner on. On February 8th, if you have any scuba divers in your life, make sure they log in. This presentation by Jessica Pate is all about manta rays here in Florida, both adult manta rays that can reach 25 feet in width, as well as juvenile manta rays. The coastal areas of South Florida, it turns out, are important nurseries for young manta rays. And this is really interesting ongoing research. I think you guys will enjoy it. February 15th is probably the one lecture I'm most excited about this season. We welcome Dr. Scott Terrell. Scott is a veterinarian, but he's also the director of all animal and science operations for Walt Disney globally. Every one of their parks, every one of their exhibits, every one of their facilities that houses live animals, Scott's in charge of that. And he's going to tell us all about Walt Disney's efforts to actively conserve our planet, both here in Florida and around the globe. On February 22nd, our presentation is going to be about a conservation initiative right here in Martin County aimed at protecting the headwaters of the South Fork of the St. Lucie River and the North Fork of the Loxahatchee River, the Lucie Headwaters Initiative. So join Greg Braun on the 22nd to learn more about efforts to protect some of the last remaining wetland and forested areas that really link these 2 unique estuaries together. On March 1st, we welcome Dr. Heather Joestig from Georgia Southern University to talk about her work in growing salt marsh cordgrass, both for restoration projects, but also to help clean up some of the runoff that's generated during aquaculture work. So it's a unique interplay between growing vegetation to restore the environment and cleaning up the waste produced during aquaculture. We have another great program for scuba divers on March 8th. We welcome Dr. Chelsea Bennis, better known as Octo Girl from Florida Atlantic University. She's going to tell us about her research in Lake Worth Lagoon, looking at the behavior of a couple of different local octopus species. And finally, on March 15th, we welcome Dr. Jeff Carrier. He is one of the world's foremost experts on shark courtship and reproduction. This is a cool story. He's one of these guys that climbs up on a ladder and stands out in the middle of a shallow body of water for days on end, watching sharks court each other. And his presentation is going to be focused on work that he's conducted in the Florida Keys over the last 2 decades. I know that's a long introduction, but I'm hoping that something I said will spark your interest and make you want to sign up for some of these other lectures. Do me a favor, make sure you go onto our website and individually register for each presentation. You have to do them one at a time. I do have a couple of other quick tidbits that aren't related to the lecture series. We are currently running guided beach walks on Friday and Sunday mornings. These will run through the end of February, and they're a unique on-the-beach educational opportunity if you're interested. Believe it or not, it's time to start thinking about summer camp already. Our summer camp registrations open in early February, and last year we were fully booked by the end of the month. So if you have any youngsters in your life who might be interested in attending a summer camp here at the Coastal Center, definitely don't drag your feet. We are currently advertising for college internship positions this summer. And finally, if you're interested, we offer private guided tours of the Florida Oceanographic Coastal Center during times that we're closed to the public. So if you and your family want to come out and visit us, maybe check out our new Ocean Eco Center building if you haven't seen it yet, but you don't want to deal with crowds, shoot me an email or visit our website. We've got lots of information online. So 1 week from tonight, we've got a fantastic lecture with Dr. Aaron Adams, the Director of Science and Conservation with Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. He's also a senior scientist at FAU's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. Aaron is going to tell us all about the work that BTT is doing to protect and conserve tarpon, including some really fascinating tagging and tracking studies to help identify movement patterns of tarpon. Some of these are short distance migrations. Some of them cover thousands of miles. He's also going to talk about efforts to identify and protect critical habitats that juvenile tarpon use. This is particularly important here in the Indian River Lagoon, where development and poor water quality are negatively impacting tarpon nurseries. So if you have anybody that likes to fish in your life, please share this lecture with them, and we hope you'll be able to join us next week. And I want to really emphasize that we do these lectures for you, but we couldn't do them without you. The reason this series is such a huge success, the reason that we're able to get great speakers each year is because we've got an amazing audience. So number one, I want you to share, try to get as many people on board as you can. And while this is a completely free lecture series, if you enjoy your time tonight, we'd love you to make a little donation to help support Florida Oceanographic's mission. Now, I do want to take a quick attendance poll. I know how many of you are logged in. I don't know how many people are at each computer. So if you could just let me know how many people are actively watching right now, it'll give me a great head count so I know how big our audience is. All right, and that brings us to the important part of tonight's program, tonight's guest speaker. Our speaker tonight, Mark Perry, needs no introduction for most of you. Mark is the Executive Director of Florida Oceanographic Society, a role that he has held for more than 40 years. I can confidently say that there are few people who have given more of their own blood, sweat, and tears towards the battle to help protect the St. Lucie River, the Indian River Lagoon, and the Florida Everglades. Tonight, Mark's going to let us know how our local waters fared during the summer of 2021, a year without major Lake Okeechobee discharges. Mark's also going to update us on efforts to improve the health of Lake Okeechobee and the Florida Everglades. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Mark Perry.
Yeah, here we are. Hey, how are you? Welcome, and thank you, Zach, for a great introduction. We're here at the kickoff the lecture series here, and I'm really here to talk about Florida's waters and how the current outlooks and plans and what we have in the future. But when we talk about Florida's waters, we're going to be talking mainly about the south portion of Florida. There are many lakes and springs and very active water coastlines all along Florida's huge coastline area. But what I want to talk about tonight is going to focus on kind of the South Florida issues and where we are. So To start with, historically, the flows in South Florida, we talk about the greater Everglades ecosystem. And this entails up at the north end, as you see on the left, of the upper chain of lakes south of Orlando, which are all connected into Lake Kissimmee, and then which flows south into Lake Okeechobee, one of the second largest lakes in continental states. So and then from there, the historic river of Grass used to flow south, very slowly, shallow river, only about 1.5 to 2 feet deep, through sawgrass marshes, the plain all the way down to the tip of Florida and into Florida Bay and connecting the Florida Keys. On the right-hand side, though, you see the current flow, the flow that we've kind of made in order to try to stop flooding and protect people, but also at the same time try to improve Florida for people to come and inhabit this section of the greater Everglades ecosystem. So over 2.5 million acres of so much diverse habitats are affected by this whole greater Everglades ecosystem in this water system. So back in the 1900s, is one of the first things we wanted to do back then was to drain the swamp, this valueless Everglades south of Lake Okeechobee, which we wanted to drain. We actually paid people like Hamilton Diston and others to come in and build canals and ditches south of the lake and divert the water out to the East Coast or West Coast and try to drain that swamp. And then in 1926 and 28, there were major hurricanes that came across the state. And unfortunately, about 2,500 people lost their lives. And that authorized the Herbert Dike, a dike around Lake Okeechobee, about 35 to 40 feet high, was built in order to protect that from ever flooding again into the nearshore areas. And so we basically dammed the lake and drained the swamp. And it got us to a point where we're now trying to control those elevations in the lake. And part of what I'm going to talk about tonight is from the existing schedule, what the Army Corps of Engineers uses is to control that lake level. And throughout the year, they take basically from January through December, whatever the elevation of the lake is, if it varies, they have an operational plan or guidance on how to release water out of the lake. And whether it goes to the water conservation areas south of the lake or over to the estuaries in both the East Coast and West Coast, as it was designed to do. So unfortunately, this happens during a year. And typically, this shows you several years of the lake elevation as it changed. And not to follow all these lines or even the blue graph, but the hydrograph shows that as the lake level enters into these different zones of regulation, they are basically following guidance, the Corps of Engineers, to release water east and west, and then also south to the Everglades. And currently right now, that was the previous schedule for regulating Lake Okeechobee, but the Corps of Engineers is now working on a Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, which is a revised or updated schedule on how to manage the lake. So it better fits what we know today is also creating flood protection, but also considering the environment and needing to send that water south to the Everglades that needs it, particularly in the dry season. What happens in 2 seasons we have in Florida, a wet season and a dry season. And typically, I don't want you to follow all of these arrows and numbers, but the idea is basically as Lake Okeechobee receives a lot of water into the lake during the wet season, it also discharges a lot to the coastal estuaries, primarily to the East Coast, over to the St. Lucie estuary, to the West Coast of the Caloosahatchee, and then, but to the south during the wet season, there's not much release of that water south. You can see the 3 structures that are circled in red here aren't releasing water south. However, there's a lot of water going south into the Everglades and Everglades National Park and Everglades conservation areas through what we call stormwater treatment areas. And those big numbers there are releasing basin runoff that comes from basically the Everglades agricultural area, which is this huge 700,000 acres south of Lake Okeechobee, which we've artificially drained and keep drained for primarily sugarcane production. But during the dry season, the opposite kind of happens in that there are obviously not many releases south, but they have a lake that they want to release water south through these three areas in order to provide water supply to the Everglades agricultural area. And again, not much flowing south from the lake into the water conservation areas during that time. So the flow of water used to continue all through the dry season down into the Everglades, which has lost that kind of flow. Just this past season, as Jack was saying, back in this summer season of water year, starting in May last year, we see a lot of inflows into Lake Okeechobee, over about almost 2 million acre feet. And again, I don't want to kind of go into relative, I want you to see relative numbers that I'm going to point out, not specific, volumes and that kind of thing. So I don't expect everybody to tune into all these difficult numbers to understand. But the point is that we're receiving inflows to Lake Okeechobee this past season of about almost 1.2 million acre feet. And basically the outflows are only about 500,000 acre feet. So the flows though that go south from Lake Okeechobee outflows are being surpassed by this huge red arrow that you see south, which is all that basin runoff from the Everglades agricultural area, this 700,000 acres south of Lake Okeechobee that fills up the Everglades with that water instead of water coming from Lake Okeechobee. And this is evidence in this kind of bar graph that you can see here when you have basically the graph on the far right. You can see the bar graph is in blue is the basin runoff from the Everglades agricultural area as 940,000 acre feet compared to only 61,000 acre feet coming from the Lake Okeechobee. So it's very disproportionate how much comes from the lake that flows south versus how much comes from the Everglades agricultural area. And again, here's that description in this past water year to show you the total inflows to the stormwater treatment areas of 940,000 acre feet compared to lake water releases to the water conservation areas of only 61,000 acre feet. So unfortunately, this loads up these stormwater treatment areas with phosphorus and it's hard for them to continue to clean the water. But we're taking up that capacity of the Everglades with mostly basin runoff from that agricultural area rather than the flows from the lake, which it was historically. So this is a typical year of how much also the pollution comes with that lake discharges to the St. Lucie estuary and the Caloosahatchee, primarily in thousands and millions of pounds of phosphorus and nitrogen and what we call total suspended solids, or TSS. That's all that suspended silt and sediment that you find in the water as it runs out the St. Lucie Canal and into the St. Lucie estuary. The nitrogen is really an issue for our saltwater and estuarine conditions, whereas phosphorus is really terrible pollutant for the freshwater conditions, including Lake Okeechobee. So this past year, we can see from left to right here how we kind of fared out. And in the small graphic, the blue coloration gives you the amount of Lake Okeechobee discharges. So you saw that we had some early on in the year in January of last year, and then again in March and April. But all of that blue disappears, and most of the rest of the year we had some local basin runoff and some runoff which lowered some of those salinities in the St. Lucie estuary. The St. Lucie estuary, primarily Indian River Lagoon, are connected to the ocean through the St. Lucie Inlet, and the basin runoff from our watershed provides the freshwater inflow. And so the connection to the ocean provides that balance of salinity that you want to get right in the middle estuary between basically 20 and 25 parts per thousand. So when it drops below 10 parts per thousand in our estuary, we really are not ranging very good, in fact, poor for oyster and seagrass and other habitat, which we'll talk about. On the Caloosahatchee side, the West Coast, they have a similar condition, although they can seem to handle more of that outflow from Lake Okeechobee. So in this case, the blue in the graph shows that during the year, they had quite a bit more releases from Lake Okeechobee in water. And then in the last part of the year had more basin runoff that came from their local basin, which is almost 700,000 acres compared to our basin of about 500,000. So I want to kind of focus in on the St. Lucie side and the estuary. These northern estuaries are such critical habitat for our nursery grounds, for all of our fish and shellfish that we find throughout Florida, but it provides us that great diversity of marine life that we have here. The red arrows indicate the St. Lucie Canal, which was dug in 1916 and completed in 1926 and improved after they built the dike around the lake in the 1930s to be that outlet, one of the outlets for the Lake Okeechobee as it gets higher, and it was engineered that way. But practically, you can see the north and south forks come together of the St. Lucie River here at Stewart. They wrap around and meet the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Lucie Inlet. I want to also point out the black lines here are canals. These were what we call C canal, C23, C24. And you can notice these are not connected to Lake Okeechobee, but these were built in the 1930s and 40s in order to provide drainage primarily for this area, which wanted to be production in citrus groves. So when we look at the amount of increase in our normal watershed, the historic watershed for the St. Lucie estuary ranges about 23 miles north of Stewart and about 10.5 miles south of Stewart. And you can see it was about 210,000 acres. With these building of the C23, 24, C25, and C44 canals, the St. Lucie Canal, it increased it almost to 525,000 acres. So a huge, much bigger watershed, and most of it artificially drained right now through these canals. This creates a huge amount of impacts, especially when we get discharges from Lake Okeechobee. The environmental impacts include loss of oyster reef, seagrass beds and habitat, and even the nearshore reef, coral reefs. As you can see, the plume of that suspended silt and sediment and low salinity gets out over our nearshore coral reefs, south and north of the St. Lucie Inlet. It also creates human health issues and impacts that you've seen on blue-green algae blooms and bacteria, high bacterial levels that create that human health issue, and then also economic impacts. When we get this pollution and this water turning into this situation where it affects our whole economy, not only directly through boating, fishing, and other direct sources, but the real estate values and the retail and economic sources around our area are really impacted. This kind of graphic just real briefly shows you the normal salinities at the middle of the estuary near the Roosevelt Bridge in the St. Lucie is about 20 to 25 parts per thousand on the left-hand side. But when we get these huge discharges from Lake Okeechobee, that salinity drops almost to zero, which is fresh water. So when it drops down to that freshwater condition and stays below that 10 parts per thousand in salinity, which causes stress, harm, and even death to the oysters, depending on whether they're spat or juveniles or adult oysters. They really can't tolerate more than about 28 days or so in being total freshwater conditions before they expire. The same thing is for the seagrasses. Seagrass are another really important habitat. It's a grass that flowers and seeds underwater in shallow water conditions, but requires light to penetrate and also salinity conditions to be right for seagrass. Unfortunately, over the years with these discharge events, the graph shows we get a huge decline in our seagrass beds, including threatened and endangered species. And the same kind of salinity graph in the outer estuary shows that, as it gets below this 10 part per thousand threshold, that we get that, several days at that level will cause destruction of seagrass habitat. And it's been pretty well documented in these two visual photographs. You can see the left-hand side being 2010 compared to the right-hand side at 2017. This is just inside the St. Lucie Inlet. And you can see the sand sandbars or the sandy bottom compared to the darker color, which is indicating seagrass. So we've lost several hundred acres of seagrass habitat over the recent years. And also we've seen a destruction in the lake itself through cyanobacteria or harmful algae blooms, or what we call blue-green algae blooms. And these algae blooms have occurred in the lake, and particularly this in July of 2018, almost entirely covered Lake Okeechobee. So as you know, when they have to release water from the lake and they have these algae blooms, it obviously brings that freshwater algae and all of that bloom conditions out into the St. Lucie estuary, and has truly devastated our area. And it created a lot of human health issues as well. These are the St. Lucie lock and dam structure, and the St. Lucie Canal is on the right, and it discharges to the left there through the 7 gates that are opened up here. And those discharges can be as much as 4.6 billion gallons a day. That's a tremendous amount of water that comes through these gates and structures. And not only is it wasting water, it causes a lot of destruction to the habitat, as we've mentioned. So currently, right now, and actually starting a couple of years ago, the Corps of Engineers began to look at a different schedule of how to manage the lake. And this is referred to as that Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, or LASO. And they're on target to try to complete this schedule this year so that it can be implemented and have a new lake regulation schedule. And we've advocated with them, along with many, many other stakeholders around the watershed, to have 0 releases to the East Coast and only stop those harmful releases to the West Coast over in the Caloosahatchee. And as you can see in this graph here, the current modeling that they're doing on this schedule, proposed schedule, is to have 0 releases to what we call cubic feet per second. So the zeros here indicate that during these management zones in the lower zones of the lake, will be at 0 releases to the St. Lucie estuary. And only in the high bands, when the lake gets very high, near 17 feet and 18 feet, will they have to release some to the St. Lucie through the S80 structure, which is that structure I just showed you before. So they're on track to do this. They're on track to kind of put together this guidance. They go through an entire process of project delivery team meetings and all these kind of public meetings, as well as their due diligence and all the agency work that they do. And they're on target to try to complete this by the end of this year, and then implement the schedule actually starting 1st of January of next year. And this coincides with their improvements on the Herbert Dike that they've been working on and expected to be completed in November of 2022 this year. So I just wanted to touch too on a couple of other projects that are in the works that are part of this comprehensive Everglades restoration plan that affects not only these northern estuaries, but all of the watershed that we've talked about. And that is, this one is called the Indian River Lagoon South Plan. It entails part of the Indian River Lagoon and of course the St. Lucie estuary, which is connected to the Indian River. And this will basically, when completed, we're already working on some of these components. And you may have heard about the C44 reservoir and stormwater treatment areas that are now allowing to store and treat that water in the watershed before it gets released out to the lake, to the estuary. And this is going to be very helpful in improving our water quality within the watershed particularly. And the lighter green areas talk about the Allapattah natural storage and over 90,000 acres of natural storage areas. And this is really important for allowing the land to naturally store and rehydrate, and just changing the water conditions and not trying to drain it off as fast as we can. This will reduce the phosphorus and nitrogen coming into the lake, restore some of the habitat and get rid of things. There's a whole schedule of these other projects over about 68 components in this Everglades restoration plan. It started in year 2000, and they've been trying to authorize through Congress and get them appropriated through funding in Congress and also the state matching funds to be able to continue on with these projects. And it's called the Integrated Delivery Schedule. There are several that are going through. One I wanted to highlight for you was south of Lake Okeechobee. There's actually the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir and Stormwater Treatment Area. And this is an area south of Lake Okeechobee in that Everglades Agricultural Area, which are state-owned lands and the state has purchased, which will have a reservoir to store and then treat that water before it goes out from the Lake Okeechobee before it goes into the Everglades. So it's a project, a big regional project that will help to provide more storage and treatment of water from Lake Okeechobee. We'll be able to release more water from Lake Okeechobee south as it goes south to the Everglades that needs it, particularly in the dry season. So here we have the historic flow on the left and the current flow in the middle. And of course, our desired flow of water was to move water south from Lake Okeechobee the way it had moved historically in order to restore the Everglades and Everglades ecosystem, but also to spare these northern estuaries, both the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee, and provide that water source that goes down to Florida Bay that actually needs that during the dry season in order to have that estuary balanced as well. So I really want to kind of end with just kind of our mission here at Florida Oceanographic and how it's tied into what we do to talk about our Florida's waters and how we can help to work with it. We are basically mission to inspire environmental stewardship of Florida's coastal ecosystems. We do that through education, research, and advocacy. And in our program, many of you perhaps have been to the Coastal Center on Hutchinson Island. We have over 57 acres of wonderful hands-on exhibits and learning for all ages. We have aquariums and touch tanks, interactive displays and nature trails goes through the acres. And the new Ocean Eco Center, which just opened up this past year, is a wonderful exhibits about the Florida's water story, the estuaries, life along the shore and the ocean connections. You can come and learn a lot about what we've just talked about on Florida's history and Florida's water story. We have wonderful education programs. Zach Judd is our leader for our team in that, and the programs include those summer camps, the field trips, nighttime sea turtle walks, and a lot more that we do, not only here at the center, but virtually throughout classrooms throughout the world. Our research and restoration efforts at Florida Oceanographic are focused on a lot of the restoration with oyster reefs and seagrass. As we've talked about, in these ecosystems are so vital, so important for nursery grounds. And we have established these two great programs since 2005 and 2016. We've been working on these programs to restore oyster reef and seagrass habitat. Let's see. Oh. And then our research and monitoring conservation work also is our current monitoring projects include monitoring those oyster reefs, the seagrass beds, and mangrove marshes. And then on the right-hand side, we've had a water quality monitoring program using citizens water quality monitoring. We train a citizen science group to be out there. About over 40 citizens around the watershed have helped to weekly monitor this water quality in the estuary since 1998. It's been an incredible, great water quality monitoring effort. And then lastly, advocacy. We fight for clean water. We help people to understand the issues, understand the problems, both in our water situations and even along our beaches and coastal areas. And then we want you to make your voice heard. So we ask you to go to our website, click on the Take Action Now, make your voice heard. And there's action items there, like including weighing in your opinions and your work about, what your thoughts are to, let's say, the Colonel of the Corps of Engineers on the Lake Okeechobee schedule. So we ask you to make your voice heard, take some position, participate in a lot of these restoration efforts, but also participate in meetings that come up about the waters in our area. So I encourage you to visit our floridaocean.org and learn a lot more about not only the waters around Florida, but also how you can come and visit the Coastal Center, and learn a lot more about our oceanographic work that we do. So thank you for having me, Zach, and I appreciate that very much.
Awesome, Mark. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have you as our lead-in speaker. And I think for our audience tonight, this is going to be a unique opportunity to continue this conversation for as long as we want tonight. We've got questions coming in the Q&A box. You've got Mark Perry at your disposal. What I'd like all of you to do is start firing off questions for Mark. And we have plenty of time to sit down and almost turn this into a discussion. I'll moderate, Mark will answer. So go ahead and start typing. One of the first questions Mark asks about some of the local reservoirs that we've seen popping up right here in our county. There's a reservoir on the C44. There's been a C23, 24 reservoir. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the local reservoirs, how they're designed, what they're supposed to do? Will they help with Lake Okeechobee discharges? Are they designed to only help with local discharges? I think it's a good starting question.
Yeah, it is a good question, Zach. As I kind of showed in the program there's the C23, 24 canals particularly are not connected to the lake, and the C44 basin also. So these reservoirs and stormwater treatment areas connected to the reservoirs are meant to store and treat that water from those canals before it enters in and then directly discharges into the St. Lucie estuary and Indian River Lagoon. So there's the C20, what we call the Indian River Lagoon South project includes the C23, C24, C25 reservoir and stormwater treatment areas, and also the C44 reservoir and stormwater treatment area. So essentially the water is taken out of the canal before it gets too high and has to discharge out to the estuary. It's taken out of the canal, put in the reservoir, stored there, and over time goes into the stormwater treatment areas, which are man-made marshes. And that helps to take up all the nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, before it then goes out back into the estuary. So it's a very large regional projects, but underway right now and almost complete. In fact, we just completed in December, I believe they turned on, if you will, the reservoir and got it going for the C44 basin. And that again is the canal along that connects Lake Okeechobee to the estuary, but there's 116,000 acres of basin runoff that comes into the C44 canal that reservoir and STA will take care of. The C23, C24 has been authorized, and it's just starting to get under construction and appropriation. That's north, those C canals that are north of that, and they will start to, again, store and treat water as it goes. And then the C25 is actually a canal that enters directly into the Indian River Lagoon right at Taylor Creek. And that is designed to have also a small reservoir and STA connected with that. So we expect that all of those completed will help tremendously the local watershed. Again, if the water's coming from Lake Okeechobee and through the St. Lucie Canal, some of that may be taken up in the C44 reservoir, but that's not designed to, stop basically those discharges or releases. May help with that, but it's not going to eliminate those releases. That'll come directly from our lake regulation schedule that we're working on that I mentioned.
All right, this is great, folks. Thank you for firing these questions off. Every second, there's a new question popping up. So I think this Q&A session might be as valuable as the PowerPoint that Mark just went through. I'm looking through all these. We have some really, really good questions coming in. Here's one about Florida Bay. So will these proposed improvements to flow through Lake Okeechobee and then into the Everglades, will those proposed flow changes help reduce the dead zone in Florida Bay?
That's a good question too. Florida Bay is so critical because it's at the tip of Florida. And imagine the historical flow going through those vast sawgrass marshes, all the nutrients taken up and everything. By the time it reached Florida Bay and that 10,000 islands of mangrove islands there, it was so clean and pure. And it mixed with the ocean water through the Florida Keys and created this wonderful seagrass community. And unfortunately, that balance of, again, that salt estuary balance, it needs to be that higher salinity around 30 to 35 parts per thousand which is typically like the ocean. But unfortunately, when it doesn't get enough fresh water, it actually goes hypersaline or gets too salty. And Florida Bay, and a couple of times during these recent years, has gotten up to where it's 80 parts per thousand, which is almost twice or 3 times the salinity that it should be. And that has actually caused seagrass to die off and die back. So what they want to do is have that balance be able to flow through into Florida Bay on a regular basis and be able to provide that, that amount of fresh water inflow into Florida Bay. Creating some dead zones is really critical too, because their Florida Bay is fed from the tip of Florida through the Shark River Slough and also through Taylor Slough, which were natural sloughs through the bottom of Everglades National Park that go into the tip of Florida. And it's restoring those hydro periods through those flow ways that is very, very important. And they're working on things like lifting Tamiami Trail and trying to improve that. So we've created about 5 miles of bridges in Tamiami Trail to allow that flow to sheet flow back through there and reestablish that Shark River Slough and also Taylor Slough flow. So hopefully through this restoration efforts, we can begin to see that flowing back south again like it used to.
Our next question is from somebody who's joining us tonight from the west coast of Florida. They're interested in any potential improvements to the C43 Canal, or what used to be the Caloosahatchee River. Is there anything in the works to return the C43 to a river that actually meandered and naturally filtered water? I guess, we're thinking like the Kissimmee River used to be a meandering oxbow river.
Right.
I don't know that the Caloosahatchee was ever quite as meandering as the Kissimmee, but are there efforts to try to do anything to physically fix the course of the C43, or is it more about fixing where the water's coming from and how much gets into there rather than changing the structure of the river?
Right. The Caloosahatchee River was actually near almost to Lake Okeechobee, but it wasn't connected prior to the 1900s there. So its source was more around Lake Hickapachee, which is a dried up lake bed right now near Lake Okeechobee. But unfortunately, when they did connect to the lake through that artificial canal known as C43, it connected and they over dredged and drained and cut through all the oxbows that normally would meander, like you said, through the Caloosahatchee, natural Caloosahatchee River, which goes fairly to the west directly out into Pine Island Sound and into the bay right there. So that flow though was interrupted when they dug the canal through there, and unfortunately overdrained that watershed entirely. So now it doesn't get the freshwater flows into the Caloosahatchee that normally would have come. So actually their connection to the lake is important in order to supply some water to meet that minimum flow and level that the Caloosahatchee used to get before it was artificially connected to Lake Okeechobee. So they are producing a reservoir there called the C43 reservoir. Remember, on the East Coast here, we're the C44 reservoir. So on the West Coast, C43 reservoir is now being under construction. It's been authorized. It's now getting appropriations and starting construction. And they're digging, making sure they have enough reservoir storage area. And they should actually build some stormwater treatment area with that as well, in order to provide that marsh habitat for it to filter through. But it was, as you said, was cut through, overdrained. There used to be actually falls at Ortona locks and different lock structures, which then became lock structures, and they dug it as an engineered canal, unfortunately. So we really disturbed that natural river system too, over there.
All right, will the dredging of Lake Okeechobee be required to restore its ecological health? It's something you hear about from time to time. The lake used to have a sandy bottom, and now there's feet of muck on the bottom.
Right.
Do we need to dredge it to fix it? Can we even dredge it to fix it?
Yeah.
What do we do about all the muck in Lake Okeechobee?
That's a great question. The muck has built up in the bottom of Lake Okeechobee, just like it has in the St. Lucie estuary, actually, too. But in the Okeechobee, that muck becomes a source of basically phosphorus, what we call legacy phosphorus. it builds up into the muck and silt and sediments, and then can get resuspended into the water column and really cause a lot of pollution. So we need to remediate that by getting the muck out or removing the muck. There have been different proposals or thoughts or ideas. The main thing is it's just the scale of it is just so huge. I mean, it's over 730 square miles. And if you needed to, how could you remediate that or look at getting rid of the muck and removing it? It may take a lot of work to think through it. There have been suggestions to build some sort of islands in the lake where we could, like a spoil island, if you will, that would take up the muck and put it into a containment into an island area. There's been other suggestions to try to get some of it out and then cap it, put cap of sand or clean sand over top of it, which is again going to be a very, very expensive process and issue. So it's not an easy fix, and it's a really, really big problem. The main thing though is to try to stop the pollution from coming into the lake from the north. To 2 million acres north of the lake, that watershed brings a lot of phosphorus into the lake that keeps building and building up in those legacy sediments in the sediments. So we need to stop that pollution coming in and then try to remediate that by getting rid of the muck in some form or fashion down the road.
This is great. One question is very seamlessly leading to the next. So
Okay.
you talked about what could be done with the muck that theoretically could be dredged from Lake Okeechobee, but what happens to muck that gets dredged from other places? We talk about muck removal here in the Indian River.
Yep.
Where's it taken? What are they doing with all that muck?
Yeah. Well, there's a part of that Indian River Lagoon South plan is to dredge out about 7.9 million cubic yards of muck, which is a huge amount of material. And once it gets taken out and dried out, the idea is to take it out to the flat pine flatwoods in Alapata someplace and be able to spread it thin, about only 6 inches deep, and remediate it into or churn it into the soils there. It's basically, at first they thought maybe it's organic, maybe we could repurpose it, clean it up by taking fresh water through it so that it gets the salt out of it and using it for muck soils somewhere. But that muck is only less than 10% organic. So it's mostly silts and clays and very fine particles. So they've taken muck sediments out of Manatee Pocket and they've stored it on land and let it basically settle, and then they've trucked it off and used it elsewhere. So it's a process to do it, but it's gonna take a long time. But there's plans to look at the estuary where it accumulates in these deeper kind of pockets. So they could surround that with turbidity screens in order to contain it while they dredge it out, let it settle again, and then have continue that process to try to, again, remove that muck sediments, because the bottom of just like Lake Okeechobee, the bottom of the estuaries used to be a sandy bottom. And of course, the muck gets resuspended and it covers over our seagrass beds and our oyster reefs, and it's not a good thing.
You talked a little bit about nutrients coming into the lake from the north. So somebody wanted to know who causes the nitrogen and phosphorus discharges in the Lake O from the north and into our canals. Why doesn't the state and the federal governments prevent this? Residential and commercial developments have to treat their stormwater. Why are other sources not required to be held to the same standards?
It's a good point. We monitor the whole watershed, all the 32 subbasins north of the lake in the Kissimmee Valley. We also monitor all of the 186 basins in the estuaries. There's a lot of monitoring. We know where the pollution is coming from. And we also know that, back in 1970s, when we passed the Clean Water Act, we basically asked, the state was charged with implementing this, and the state came up with the plan for setting these total maximum daily loads for impaired water bodies like the St. Lucie estuary or other estuaries. So they set this total maximum daily load of phosphorus, nitrogen, or other pollutants. And when they set that load, they said, that's the maximum load that could happen to these systems to keep them, viable estuaries or viable water bodies. So when they set that limit, they basically then began to work on watersheds and said within the watershed, they need to meet that total maximum daily load. We need to reduce the phosphorus and nitrogen coming off of the watershed into the waters. So what they did is establish what they call a basin management action plan. And they tried to work with all of the people and landowners within there. They've established how much they have to reduce their phosphorus and nitrogen. And they set forward a 15-year plan in each one of these basins in order for them to reduce it. Well, they're not meeting those total maximum daily loads. They're not meeting that criteria. In fact, there's even been increases in those loadings of phosphorus, nitrogen, and other pollutants from these lands. So they're not doing that. The other implementation of regulation is through best management practices, or BMPs. And that's regulated through the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So together with Florida Department of Environmental Protection, they're supposed to mandate that these best management practices, again, reduce the phosphorus and nitrogen at the source coming off of the lands, whether they be agriculture or urban runoff or whatever. They need to meet that criteria of that total maximum daily load. And we've time and time again pointed out recent years that they are not being met. They are not meeting these criteria, and you need stronger enforcement of this water quality standards, which we've already set. We've already set the standards that have to be met. It's easy to go upstream into the watershed and say, if you're not meeting those standards, why not? Can't we regulate you specifically and help you to get to that standard so that we can meet it downstream? So unfortunately, our departments, environmental protection and Department of Agriculture, are not enforcing this law. And the Water Management District is monitoring it, knows exactly where in all the watersheds where the pollution's coming from. But all of those have to work together to enforce that water quality standard.
So efforts to fix Florida's water problems are absolutely an uphill battle, but I think most of us who are heavily invested in it have tried to remain positive. And this question maybe questions that. The guest says that history shows that our progress to date has been glacial. In the meantime, Big Sugar's pockets have only gotten deeper. Is it realistic to think that we'll ever achieve the goal of sending clean water south as long as the sugar industry controls so much of the land south of Lake Okeechobee? It's a good question.
Yeah, it's one that I keep asking myself year after year too. It's amazing how long this takes, or if we ever are making any progress, or if we'll ever make any progress because of that strong lobby. The industries, whether they're agriculture or others, have huge amounts of lobby effort. But what overcomes that is the political will to make those changes happen. And what makes that happen is you and I and other voices coming together and demanding that we have clean water. And if we all are strong about that and really voice our strong concern about that and demand it, then basically that'll be on to the politicians to have to weigh out whether they're going to get our votes the next time they're up for election, or whether they're going to, give in to the lobbyists who are paying for their campaign. So it's a big power struggle, if you will, but I got to believe that our voices are getting stronger and our voices are getting louder, and we're just enough is enough, and we're fed up with this polluted water system. And I want people to remember what clean water can be like and what it can really do. So in this past year, when we've had fairly good conditions and not a lot of pollution or discharges into the system, we've experienced, a lot of us, that clean water condition that can happen. Unfortunately, it's so nice and clean, we look down and we see the loss of habitat like oysters and seagrass. But we got to remember that that's what we're fighting for. And we got to be loud. We got to demand clean water. And it's totally within our right. And I've got to believe that with more voices shouting and demanding from politicians to make it right, whether it's in Congress or the state legislature, those are the focus of our efforts, have to be there.
So there's no doubt that, here in Stewart at the south end of the IRL, we are being heavily impacted by discharges from Lake O. But as you move further north, the Indian River Lagoon is being affected by other very different issues. But sometimes we hear people concerned about Lake O discharges affecting areas further and further north. And I think some of it's a naming issue. We've got more than one Taylor Creek. So one of our guests tonight asks, are there any impacts from water coming from the north end of Lake Okeechobee, like from Taylor Creek that dumps into the Indian River Lagoon in Fort Pierce? So I think that's a pretty important distinction to make.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. The name Taylor Creek does apply to a creek that comes into the north east side of Lake Okeechobee. But it's also a creek that comes out into the Indian River Lagoon over on the east coast. But the creek and the watershed north of Lake Okeechobee, there are two smaller creeks, Taylor Creek and Nubbin Slough, that were one of the highest nutrient-rich inflows into the lake than any other inflow, even though they were small creeks and small sloughs that entered into the lake. And the reason was that back in the 70s and 80s, there was huge dairy farming going on in those creek areas. And that's what a lot of that runoff from those dairy farms, unfortunately, was channeled down the Taylor Creek right into Lake Okeechobee, channeled down into Nubbin Slough. And they basically arrested that by being able to stop those dairy farming from happening in those areas. They put in some stormwater treatment areas, and they've really reduced that amount of inflow of nitrogen and phosphorus into the lake from those particular areas. But north of that, all the way up to the upper chain of lakes south of Orlando, again, about 2.5 million acres of watershed around the Kissimmee Valley. All of that watershed comes into the Kissimmee, comes down into the lake. And in every part of that watershed, all of these 9 major subbasins and 32 smaller subbasins, we know we can go up there and find where that pollution is coming from. And that's where we need to address the source of the problem. And whether it's a landowner, a big cattle ranch, or small landowner who has just developments and property that has runoff that's causing pollution, it's eventually getting into there. And there have been some efforts to try to change rules, primarily what we call rule is 40E61, which was when the Water Management District actually had control over that, regulating that pollution that's coming off of that watershed. And they were trying to revise that rule and update that rule, and it got railroaded by some of the lobbyists in the state legislature a year or so ago. So we're trying to rectify that and trying to say, look, we've got to have stronger regulation in that watershed in order to stop that pollution at the source of the problem before it enters the watershed. And I have to believe landowners would be willing to get support to be able to do that and stop that pollution before it gets into our waters. And if we can do that at the source, that's the best way to address it.
Great. So you touched on this next question a little bit during your presentation, but I think we can dig into it a little deeper. Can you explain how Alligator Alley and Tamiami Trail impede the natural flow of water in the Everglades, and what's in the works to reopen that pathway to Florida Bay? And then when will that pathway actually be functioning? When will it be reopened and water will start to flow under those roads again?
So back in the 1920s, there was the wise idea was to build a connection between Miami and Naples, Florida. So they built basically right across the highway, right across the Everglades, and cut right through that river of grass that was flowing down. It took a lot of dredging and building this big berm, if you will, to put the roadbed on. So it created a dam, if you will, to stop that flow, right, a river of grass. And in recent years, we've said, well, one of the things we have to do is open that back up. So there have been small culverts in there on the west-hand side. There are about 4 so culverts that were connecting it, but that's not enough. We needed to elevate that entire 11 miles, if you will, of stretch between that section of the Everglades, above, right at the north side of Everglades National Park. So what they've done is been able to use Department of Transportation funding and other funding for Everglades restoration and be able to lift up about a 5.5 mile stretch in 2 different sections, particularly on the east side of Tamiami Trail. They've lifted that up and they're directing the flows now over there. And I personally witnessed some of that flow going through Tamiami Trail recently, and it's a really great sight to see. You can just kind of see where it was a dam because of the roadbed cutting right across that shallow river grass. Now that it's open, you can see that flow going through, and it really, really makes you feel good.
So we're going to switch gears and think about human health a little bit with this question. How do discharges from Lake Okeechobee, particularly when toxic cyanobacteria are present, affect air quality in the area? The viewers notice that sometimes our air quality index isn't that great, and they're wondering if that could potentially be linked to the health of our estuary and Lake O discharges.
Yes, sure. The cyanobacteria microcystin aeruginosa microcystin is the toxin in there. And this microcystis aeruginosa has really created a focus on how it affects our health. At first, we know that the ingestion or taking in of that can actually cause the microcystins a hepatotoxin, which affects your liver. But it has caused death in animals, particularly dogs who have ingested it. But it's also very toxic to your health, and it becomes airborne if it gets so concentrated in some areas, and it becomes airborne. And in recent years, when it's concentrated in marinas or canals or waterways, you literally have to wear a mask because you can't hardly breathe when it's around. Now, it's not as strong as a red tide, which is also a dinoflagellate organism that gives off a toxin into the air, which becomes airborne and can really affect your lungs. But they've recently studied that even the microcystin toxin in this harmful algal blooms can affect your lungs as well. So the advice is, if you see an algae bloom, don't go near it, don't be near it, don't allow your dogs or any animals nearby to ingest it. It's just really, really bad overall for health. So unfortunately, we've seen, fishermen are out there fishing right through the blue-green algae blooms, and we try to talk to them and tell them about that. So it's a very, very big health concern. And in the hospitals locally, even I had a part of the slide up there where they used to have signage, and still do actually, that says if you've have these symptoms like coughing or nausea or different types of symptoms that may be related to this exposure to this harmful algae bloom, you should contact us and let us know. And that's particularly during these times.
Mark, do you have any idea when the new LOSOM protocol will actually go into effect? So we'll stop seeing flows into the St. Lucie from Lake O, except under those extreme high lake conditions?
Yeah, we would like it to happen right now, but unfortunately, it's going through this process. The Corps of Engineers has this very, regimented process of the, environmental impact statements they're formulating. They're going through the stakeholder public meetings and process. And once they complete that this summer, then it'll go to the chief's report. The chief of engineers will sign it. It'll go to Congress and it'll be authorized. And then it'll be all good. And they expect that to happen in November or December this year. Once that happens, then it becomes implementation. The Corps will begin to actually regulate the lake under that schedule, and we'll start to see that results probably this time, the beginning of next year.
Great. It's a big move in the right direction for sure.
Yeah.
So on one of your slides, you showed a map with lots of arrows going from the lake into the Everglades agricultural area during the dry season to make sure that cropland is well irrigated. And then in the wet season, that same map had arrows going from the EAA south, presumably because that area used to be the Everglades. The soils get wet, the wet soils can damage the crop that's grown there rather than letting nature take its course. So one of our viewers is just wondering, if the water south of the lake isn't coming from the lake, where's it coming from? Where's that water in the agricultural area coming from?
It basically comes from what they call runoff or basin runoff. And in order they have artificially drained, there's over 289 structures that enter into the Miami, North New River, Hillsborough canals that go right through the Everglades agricultural area. So those major canals that were originally put in a drain now have all these structures connected to them that drain the ditches and everything in the Everglades agricultural area. And what they do is they try to maintain that water table at an elevation that's about 28 to 30 inches below the roots of the sugarcane for a perfect harvest. So when it gets too high in those canals, or in the water table, they basically pump it in and drain it into these canals and demand that that water go through the stormwater treatment areas and down south into the Everglades and water conservation areas, which fills them up. And then there's no capacity for putting water from Lake Okeechobee south into those Everglades and water conservation areas. So consequently, we're paying to basically artificially drain that area for ideal conditions for their crop production. You know, even sugarcane fields could be flooded for 2 weeks or more without just damaging the crop, but they don't allow that. They want it to be perfectly drained, particularly in the wet season. And then they want that water supply in the dry season, again, to maintain the crop, to set the crop during that dry season. So that's why you see water going from the lake south into the water conservation, into the Everglades agricultural area, but you don't see any going south through the stormwater treatment areas to the Everglades in the dry season. But in the wet season, it's all going out to us, and they're allowed to drain the Everglades agricultural area into the water conservation areas in the Everglades. And that's not healthy. We're paying for that stormwater treatment to take out the phosphorus, to meet the phosphorus limits of down to 10 parts per billion in the limit in the Everglades. And you and I pay about 20 million a year in maintaining those man-made marshes, those stormwater treatment areas through our taxes in the district. So it's a very unfortunate situation. The more we make this transparent, we tell the story, it's basically, why are we allowing that sugar industry to be maintained with having a profitable crop at the expense of having us to maintain those treatment areas, maintain that water supply, maintain their water systems at the expense of discharging this water east and west to the estuaries. It's really, the more we have to make this transparent that this is what's going on, so that people get upset about it and tell them we got to make a change here.
Mark, that's a great lead into our next question. One of our viewers just would love to know a little bit more about what's involved in stormwater treatment. Can you give just the briefest overview of how a stormwater treatment area or an STA functions to remove nutrients from water?
Right, it's essentially they lock off an area with a very shallow berm, and they want to allow it to fill up with basically about 1 foot to 1.5 foot of water. Very shallow, but they want to grow in there submergent and emergent vegetation. And that means the different kinds of grasses that can grow out, like cord grasses and other kind of grasses, and even cattails that grow in there. But the idea that that vegetation, including the periphyton, which is a very small kind of growth that's in that ground area inside that stormwater treatment area. These are man-made kind of marshes that allow that uptake of nutrients. So as you put water from the reservoir or into these stormwater treatment areas, they uptake the nutrients, and then it reaches certain levels and is allowed to slowly go off of there into the water body, whether it's the Everglades or back into the estuaries. And that basically takes out the phosphorus, the nitrogen, and uptakes it into the plants and the nutrients. And so that cycles through. It's also good for carbon sequestration. It helps in climate change if we build more marshes and we restore more wetlands. So restoring the Everglades or restoring wetland habitat is good for water quality treatment. And it's also good for sequestering carbon dioxide. It's good.
All right, thinking technology a little bit, our colleagues at Orca and Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute operate networks of automated sensors in the Indian River Lagoon. And one of our viewers was wondering your personal thoughts regarding using those remote in situ chlorophyll sensors, maybe as a an alarm or an alert to help make us more aware of blooms before they really become readily detectable to the naked eye.
That's exactly right. Those two organizations you mentioned, Orca and as well as Harbor Branch Oceanographic, they've both come up with remote sensing instrumentation to put in the waterways at different locations. And in fact, I think Harbor Branch has also put one in Lake Okeechobee in order to determine those chlorophyll levels, or that chlorophyll A level, as when it rises and gets to a certain levels, you can almost guarantee there'll be an algae bloom sometime take place because the conditions are just right. So it's monitoring those nutrients and those nutrient levels and chlorophyll A levels that can tell us or kind of give us that forecasting ability, if you will, for knowing what that water quality is doing. And it's fortunate that we have organizations, even private organizations like Orca or the Harbor Branch, who have developed this instrumentation independently of the state. But it's really up to the state and the state agencies, which we rely on, and particularly the Water Management District, South Florida Water Management District has a huge network of monitoring stations that they can also detect those levels of chlorophyll A for algae blooms and other things, as well as all the other nutrient suite of nutrients and other chemistry that's in the water. And they have been doing this, monthly, quarterly, weekly, periodically, and in hundreds and hundreds and thousands of spots all throughout the watershed. And it's just not it's all stored in a DB Hydro database. The water managers try to use that water, pass that on to the regulation people like the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and Florida Department of Agriculture, so they could use that data. And we're encouraging them use that data, not the modeling efforts for land use that they've been using to regulate. They should use the actual data that's coming off of the land and into the water body. So it's great that we have the independent monitoring by the Orca or Harbor Branch or even Citizens Water Quality Monitoring like Florida Oceanographic. But what we need is really that state agencies to be in charge of that water quality monitoring data, and then rely on that to really focus in on where is the pollution coming from and how can we abate that pollution.
Mark, we have a couple of septic related questions. I'm going to try to consolidate them a little bit. What about all the leaking septic tanks along the estuary, and what pressure can we put on the county to insist that faulty septic systems are corrected? And I want to add, I just read a paper the other day that really highlighted the point that it doesn't have to be a faulty septic tank or a leaking septic tank. In a lot of parts of Florida, especially coastal areas where the water table is right below your feet, you have sandy soil, even properly functioning septic, it really isn't that great for our groundwater and our estuary. So what can we do about septic? What can our counties do to fix the septic issue? What can the state do to try to move from septic to consolidated stormwater wastewater treatment? Where do we go with septic?
Well, septic is systems have been used for many years and are in Florida. And unfortunately, those were the individual systems that we used throughout Florida, and try to use a lot in the Florida Keys, for instance, where they really don't have the soils, any kind of soils. They have a rock, they're built on coral reefs essentially. So there's no drainage, no percolation, and the septic tank and the drain fields connected to them cannot even function properly down there. So they've quickly realized down there that they have to connect to a central wastewater treatment system. But up here in these areas, there are places, even in rural areas, where septic tanks in a low density rural area may be functional and working okay for a single family use. But when they're high density and in very compressed urban areas, and they're septic tanks right along the waterfront, and as you said, in water tables that are right up to your feet necessarily, they're not functional, and they're creating a lot more pollution than we want to realize. In Martin County, for instance, in the St. Lucie estuary, we have approximately 27 or 30,000 septic tanks in the whole area. And however, those connected and causing water pollution and nitrogen increases in nitrogen are maybe only relative to about 10 or 12% of the total nitrogen inflows to the system. Not to say that it isn't an issue or a problem, but there are other areas where we need to concentrate our efforts that are, again, highly concentrated septic tanks, very poorly maintained, or drain fields that are now leaching into our water bodies, and we need to connect those to a central wastewater system. And so there's a big effort ongoing statewide to try to connect these, to have the counties and municipalities and fund them through grants and grant programs, and also fund individuals. We push the legislature to try to get individual funding because it's going to cost the individuals to hook up to their central and wastewater system. But ideally, the septic tanks would go away and we'd all be hooked up to kind of a central wastewater treatment plant. But remember, there's still going to be the bio waste that comes from that. Even wastewater treatment plants basically consolidate the solid waste and basically have to dispose of that at some point. The water is then cleaned up and then returned to the water systems. But the idea of the solid waste from those wastewater treatment plants are still being spread over areas way out in rural Florida. But unfortunately, they're being spread at rates that are bad for the environment. And what I'm speaking about is instead of correctly spreading them and amending them into soils, they're being spread too thick and being taken on, and that biosolids and bio waste are really a problem and an issue in and around Lake Okeechobee and around the Indian River Lagoon and other areas. So there have been steps taken recently to try to regulate that spreading of what they call AA or AAA, biosolids.
The next question really underscores the complexity of Everglades restoration, where some areas are getting too much fresh water and other areas are desperate for more fresh water. The guest wonders if sending water east damages seagrass in the Indian River Lagoon, won't sending water south do the exact same thing in Florida Bay?
Well, it's all about the quantity, quality, timing, and that distribution. So as we want to send more water south, we want to send it in a timing fashion. What happened normally is that water used to flow south from Lake Okeechobee at about 1 mile every 4 days. So think of that as 1 mile every 4 days, that very slow moving body of water. Took about 16 months to reach from Lake Okeechobee to the tip of Florida. So we don't want to rush that water down there, but we need to send it down there slowly and allow it to flow during that dry season as well as the wet season through Tamiami Trail and flow slowly. If it does that, then it will uptake those nutrients, and the fresh water moving into the Florida Bay will be that clean fresh water that we need to mingle with the saltwater environment of the Florida Keys, and that's what will be ideal. Obviously, if we send it quickly and fast through canals or channels or other kind of engineered facilities, it's going to be a really bad situation. In fact, that's what we did in the Kissimmee Valley. Remember, we basically the meandering Kissimmee River took about 6 months to go from the upper chain of lakes all the way to Lake Okeechobee, as it meandered a 105-mile river all the way down in about a 2-mile wide floodplain. But what happened is when we channelized it back in the late 60s, early 70s, we dug a C38 canal right up the middle and overdrained the system. So now it only takes about 3 days. You get rain in the upper chain of lakes, with 3 days later, all of that's rushed down into Lake Okeechobee. So we need to slow the water down and allow it to flow naturally and slowly through the watershed. The elevation naturally goes from about 60 foot above mean sea level in the upper chain of lakes down to 0 at Florida Bay. And that's the way the water should flow. But it should flow slowly so that nutrients can be uptake and it won't harm the receiving body water like Florida Bay.
Most of the inlets that connect the Indian River Lagoon to the Atlantic Ocean are either entirely man-made, like Sebastian Inlet, or at the very least, heavily dredged and widened by us. Has the construction of these artificial inlets or modified inlets between the Indian River Lagoon and the ocean caused any environmental damage to either the lagoon itself or to the ocean?
Well, that's a good point. As you saw in the pictures, I mean, the connection to the St. Lucie Inlet, which was artificially dredged through a very narrow part of the barrier island at the time, was dredged through, and then it widened itself, and then they've been putting jetties up to maintain that inlet. As you said, some of these inlets broke through, like we had natural inlets at Fort Pierce, north of Fort Pierce Inlet, and also at Jupiter. But then we've maintained them as kind of artificial connections. Inlets do provide that connection to the estuaries, and unfortunately all that polluted water, highly suspended silt and sediment, goes out of the estuary and around the nearshore reefs that are around St. Lucie Inlet, for instance, and can be harmful. The other way is that if too much salt water for too long a duration comes in, it could be harmful. If you have too much inundation of ocean water into an estuary system, it may create more problems for the estuary as well, and be that imbalance again. So we have to be careful when we do have these connections, and we try to maintain these artificial connections to the Indian River Lagoon. We have about 5 or so inlets from Ponce de Leon Inlet north of Cape Canaveral all the way down to Jupiter Inlet. So these inlets, again, like you said, are mostly artificially maintained or have been artificially made. And some people believe, though, that they do provide, a way to help clean the water. So there's even proposals recently to have another inlet cut or more culverts or pipes that are put in from the ocean into the Indian River in order to help create flushing or create more tidal flow into these lagoons or estuaries. We got to be real careful about that, though, because, we got to let nature take its course. Along our barrier island, stretching from Cape Canaveral south to Jupiter, as you know, there are very thin portions of that barrier island. And during hurricanes, in fact, recent hurricanes like Hurricane Francis and Jean that came through in 2004, 2005, we basically got that breakthrough of that narrow portion of barrier island just north of the St. Lucie Inlet. So it opened a new inlet for about 24 hours as it broke through and naturally created a new inlet. But so inlets come and go and naturally in barrier islands, but when we want to maintain one for navigation or for whatever reason, we've got to be very careful how we make those connections and whether they're going to be good for the estuary and the ocean or whether they're going to create impacts that we are going to have to remediate later on.
One of our viewers asks whether there are specific petitions that they can sign to help support efforts to fix Florida's waters. This might be a good chance to talk about our advocacy website.
Yes, on our website at floridaocean.org, you'll see the page scroll by. You can take action or make your voice heard. Click on that and learn more about that. It goes immediately to some of our messaging currently about LASO, about the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, where you fill in the information and you write your own letter to the Corps of Engineers. We have suggested language there. So you can actually, directly impact a letter right to the Corps of Engineers and let them know how you feel about that situation. We're having other messaging go on there. There's other organizations that work as well, like we do, that have advocacy efforts, Captains for Clean Water, Friends for the Everglades. There are many organizations that you can find out how do I take action. Audubon, Sierra Club. We also join coalitions, and we have coalition conferences and meetings where we pull together coalitions of organizations. Those are great opportunities to make your voice heard as well. But there are petitions that go around and they are effective. We've worked with some of them and actually I remember taking stacks of petitions to the governor and cabinet one year and putting them on their desk. And it's very impressive. What's also impressive is our own testimony, our personal testimony about why it's important to us. The legislatures and congressmen pay a lot more attention to that than they do a stack of letters that are all the same letter. So it's important for all of us to write our own testimony, knowing the facts, knowing what's going on in pollution, and demanding clean water for our environment and for our drinking water future. I mean, we have to demand that. And it has to be one of the most important issues in facing Florida as we go forward. So whatever we can do to participate and to sign up a petition, sign a letter, write your own letter, just make sure that everybody is hearing from you and collectively hearing from us so that we can make our voice heard and take some action.
And Mark, I know sometimes it's hard to think that those little actions actually matter, but they really are. The actions of us as everyday citizens are really driving some of the big political changes we've seen in the last couple of years. Don't ever think that the little things you're doing are insignificant. They really do matter.
Right.
So we're coming up on 8 o'clock. I unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get to everybody's questions, but I have one question that I've been looking at for the last little bit here. I wanted to save this one for last. And I think it's something that a lot of us think about on a regular basis. The viewer says, please tell us about your real hope for the future. Many of us hear news on a daily basis that discourages us about these efforts to restore the river of grass and our Florida ecosystems. What does the future really look like to you?
It really looks like we're headed in a good direction, because now there are more of us that are talking about that restoration and why we need clean water. So there's a lot more people right now talking to us that we have. And so I have a lot of hope, I'm encouraged by, what it takes to make change happen. And because of our voices now collectively talking to our legislature and our Congress, they're starting to listen, I believe. And so I have to have hope for the future in that direction. I also have to have, I see younger folks getting involved. I mean, it's not just those of us who've been in it for so many years. It's now younger people who are now getting involved and taking action. We have a group called the River Kids, or people that are, getting engaged in this at a very, very early age. So not only are they getting educated and understand the issues, they're taking action. And believe me, when congressmen and legislatures see young people getting engaged, they know that it's an issue that we're really concerned about for the future. I mean, look at what happened at the climate summits when young people get up and start talking. I mean, that really gets our focus and focuses our attention on what we need to do to correct the problem. So we've got to pass the baton. We've got to make sure that the people we're passing the baton to run the rest of the relay race, we've got to make sure they understand the issue, they know the playing field and who the political climates are and how to get through it and what to do about it. So hopefully when we turn around, pass that baton to somebody to run the rest of the race, they're going to be ready to do that. So that's part of our job in education. It's so vital, so important. So if you know something and teach somebody else, and now we've got a couple of voices going forward, that's what it's all about. That's what makes me hopeful for the future.
Awesome, Mark. What a great way to end a presentation. Thank you so much for giving your evening to us tonight. I know our audience appreciates it. At our peak, we had well over 200 people watching tonight. And even now, after almost an hour of a Q&A roundtable, we still have over 100 people logged in and listening and learning. So I appreciate your time, Mark, but more importantly, I appreciate all of you for joining us tonight. Remember, we have a lecture every Tuesday for the next 8 weeks after tonight. If you haven't already registered for next week's talk with my friend, Dr. Aaron Adams, please do. It's going to be a fantastic talk. Aaron's a wonderful speaker, a great scientist, and he's going to tell an incredibly captivating story. Share this with your friends. Let's try to get as many people involved as possible. If every one of you shared this link to the Coastal Lecture Series with one other person, we'll have record attendance this year. Have a wonderful night, everybody, and I hope to see all of you 1 week from tonight here for our next Coastal Lecture Series installment. Thanks again, Mark. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Take care.